I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we begin this edition of the show, I want to direct you to my one and only sponsor. I've needed a sponsor now just to keep things going with Parallax Views. It's a combination of my very generous Patreon supporters, which I'm hoping more of you will subscribe to the Patreon. I could really use it. And my one sponsor, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, that makes this show possible. Wall Street Window is a great resource for financial and trading news. Mike really is a straight shooter, which is highly appreciated if you want really good financial advice. At his website, wallstreetwindow.com, you can get a copy of his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern that I have ever used. And you can also sign up for his trading newsletter, which I highly recommend. So if you can, head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, and also if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. That'll really help me out. As I said recently on X, Twitter, whatever it's called these days, I'm not making David Pakman money. I ain't getting any money from Chorus. So if any of you are aware of that situation, if you aren't, I'll put it this way. I do not really get the kind of money you see a lot of other streamers getting. And I don't begrudge anyone for that, any other streamers for that, but I'm very independent with this. This is a very independent operation. So it's you listeners and Mike Swanson that makes this show possible. So if you can, support me on Patreon. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Richard Silverstein of the Tikkun Olam blog, which deals with issues pertaining to the Israeli security state. And we'll be talking about his recent article for Jacobin entitled, "The Genocide Has Turned Americans Against Israel." We'll talk shifting U.S. public opinion on Israel amidst what is happening in Gaza. And we'll also talk about a recent report from an IDF general essentially declaring the Israeli operations in Gaza a failure. And of course, we'll discuss the Great Trust program and what that means for Gaza. If you're not familiar with the Great Trust, that's an acronym for the Gaza Reconstitution, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation Trust. Is it really what some are trying to hype it up as, or more of a grift? I think you probably know the answer to that, but we'll be discussing that with Richard Silverstein on this edition of the program. And with that being said, let's get to it with Richard Silverstein. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very happy to have on. Richard Silverstein runs the Tikkun Olam blog, which examines the underbelly and sort of machinations of the Israeli national security state. He also writes for Jacobin, and he wrote a piece in Jacobin entitled "The Genocide Has Turned Americans Against Israel." That will form a good deal of our conversation today. How are you doing, Richard? I mean, all things considered, it's hard to ask how anyone is feeling seeing what we're seeing happen.
Yeah, the last 2 years have been very hard. I've been kind of an observer of Israel and apartheid and its crimes for decades. And this is the worst. I mean, the Americans are facing the worst they ever faced in their history with Trump, and now, Israel is doing the worst that it's possibly the worst that it's ever done in its entire history. So life is not fun these days.
I think what's interesting is I think there has been a turning of the tide. I mean, even even using the word genocide a year ago in relation to what we see in Gaza, a lot of people would try to push back on it or make excuses. I'm now seeing voices that admittedly were, uh, how shall I put it, um, not using
Taboo.
that term. Yeah, or
Hmm.
tepid about it, that are now using that term. The chief among them, Dov Waxman at UCLA, who's been on this show, he used to say, I don't think it's a genocide. This past month, to his credit, he said, I think it's genocide now. And, that's a pretty moderate voice on all of these things saying that. We have Holocaust historians saying it. What do you think about this sort of change that we've seen in the past few months and people calling this what it is?
Well, I think unfortunately it's taken a genocide, as you say, to cause this sea change in attitudes among Americans, American Jews as well. And Lost my train of thought here. Oh, I know what I want to say. So I think there's a couple of really interesting developments in terms of political rhetoric regarding this. Of course, the issue of genocide is one that has been taboo. And by the way, 20, 30 years ago, the term apartheid used in connection with Israel was also taboo, and it's gradually become normalized by Israel's behavior, Israel's policies. So not just genocide has become an accepted term, but the whole idea of suspending military aid to Israel is now on the table. When people in the past few decades talked about this issue, they were viewed with suspicion and skepticism, and they were sort of excommunicated from mainstream discourse.
Can I
And
add
now
to that
we,
really briefly, if I could? I
sure.
just wanted to say, I mean, even I was told by, other people that are in media world that do their own shows, you may want to not use that term. You can use ethnic cleansing, don't use the G word. Um, I think a lot of people, even up until recently, were very scared of using that term for whatever reasons they may have had. But now it seems like the dam has broke.
Yeah, I think that they were reluctant to use the term because of the Holocaust itself. And that was this horrendous event in Jewish history and in world history. And so it was like the third rail that you couldn't touch because of that. But now Israel has murdered perhaps, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, according to several public health estimates prepared by one prepared by a University of Edinburgh public health specialist. So that's legitimate. That's a genocide. There's just no way around it. And as you mentioned about Holocaust scholars, I think several hundred Holocaust and genocide academics signed a letter this week or last week saying that it's a genocide. So this isn't like an outlier concept now. This is the mainstream. And they're the outliers are the Israel apologists and Trump and his toadies who are trying to defend the indefensible. So I think it took a horrible, horrible tragedy to get here. But as long as there is a tragedy, I think that that these attitudes really need to change. And I wanted to talk about Congress because that's where some of the sea change is happening among Democrats. Not just the sort of old stalwarts of Bernie Sanders and the squad, Now you've got sort of mainstream Democrats, by the way, some of whom shared some of that $100 million in campaign lucre that was showered on pro-Israel Democrats who defeated progressive critics of Israel in Democratic primaries. So now some of them are signing on to this bill that's called Block the Bombs, which would, I'm not sure whether the provision is to just stop offensive military aid to Israel or all military aid to Israel. It's possible that it's the more lukewarm version because they are trying to get centrist Democrats to sign on, but you've got a bunch in Congress that never would have considered this. And these changes, some of which I outlined, some of this polling data is just should be horrifying to Israel's supporters and apologists. I'm not sure whether it will be, but it indicates just a list of things. A plurality of Americans favor suspending military aid to Israel. A majority feel that Gaza is a genocide. A majority oppose Israel's policies. Their majority even oppose Trump's policies regarding Gaza. So all of these are poll results that would be unthinkable, as recently as 2 years ago or more.
Well, even I mean, I know this isn't. We'll get into the polling stuff, but even that article that Omar Bartov, the Holocaust historian, wrote in the New York Times, I mean, it feels like a century ago, but it was only in June. I'm a genocide scholar. I know it when I see it. To be honest, I couldn't imagine the New York Times publishing that, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago. So there has been a sea change, and maybe you could talk about some of the specific data we have from these polls. I think the first poll that you mentioned is the Quinnipiac poll.
Quinnipiac, yeah. Yeah, that's the main poll that I'm talking about. But even if you look at Gallup, which is sort of a Republican-oriented pollster, it confirms it. It confirms, for example, the Gallup does, that more Democrats support Palestine than Israel. And by the way, the Quinnipiac poll confirms that more Americans, by 37 to 36%, are supporting Palestine over Israel. That is the lowest level of support for Israel ever in the history of the Quinnipiac poll, which they've been taking for years. And so this is amazing that more Democrats support Palestine than Israel. You've never ever seen a poll result like that. So let's talk about what is going to be the impact of this in real time. It doesn't matter. So you and I talked about this before we started. I think that as far as American Jews are concerned, which pretty much mirror what Americans as a whole believe, maybe there's a shade more, support or tilting a little bit more towards Israel, but the results aren't that dissimilar. So American Jews, I don't think, will have a lot of impact on this because Netanyahu and the far right in Israel have already written off American Jews. They've written them off for a decade or more. But the support of the mainstream Jewish communal groups, whose leaders are white and wealthy, I call them the gerontocracy. They are all in on Israel. And that's all that Netanyahu cares about. Now, in terms of American opinion, the way in which this matters is in Congress and in the White House. So if in 2026, the Democrats can have a good result and take control of one or both houses, which is not a done deal, by the way, then this process will continue until the war ends, which there's no prospect soon of that happening. And then in 2028, if there's a candidate who comes forward who's willing to take a more independent perspective on this. Someone possibly, hopefully, like J.B. Pritzker, who's called for a suspension of much of military aid to Israel. And by the way, whose relatives were Holocaust victims, and who made that ferocious statement of resistance against Trump a week or two ago. So that's a candidate that may, I emphasize may, have the guts to take this kind of position. But we need to see Democratic candidates for president who are not the Harris and Biden. And so far, from what I've seen, Newsom, Buttigieg, and Whitmer are not going to be those candidates. They are bought and paid for by the lobby. They haven't expressed a murmur of opposition to the genocide, or even mentioned the term genocide. So for them, it's still a third rail, and those candidates are irrelevant and toxic if they were to we were to have the misfortune of them winning the presidency.
I was going to say, I think you would even tie this into the rise, the meteoric rise, I would say, of Zohran Mamdani in New York City, the mayoral candidate. And we see these figures like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries trying to distance themselves from him. It seems like you have a whole faction within the DNC that is this sort of I mean, I would say they're gerontocratic, and they're an old guard, and they don't realize where their own base is at.
Yeah. Well,
Do you
as far
think
as
these two things are connected, though, Mamdani and the bigger picture of this with Gaza?
absolutely. I mean, the governor of New York, where Mamdani, is going to hopefully become the mayor of New York, uh, refuses to endorse him. Jeffries and Schumer refused to endorse him. I saw a video of Jeffries being interviewed, and the interviewer asked a question like, when are you going to endorse him? And he just did backflips. You know, he was hemming and hawing and stuttering, and he couldn't get words out because he's trying to dance and tiptoe around the issue. But they render themselves irrelevant by engaging in this sort of like I don't know what's the word, this sort of tap dance around issues like this. Look, they've got to face the music here. Zohran Mamdani won a decisive victory in the primary. He trampled on Andrew Cuomo, the scion of the New York political dynasty, family dynasty, and he made Andrew Cuomo essentially, excuse me, essentially irrelevant politically. He consigned him to the political dustbin of history. So Mamdani is the future. Schumer, Jeffries, they're the past. They may not know it yet, but they're the past. And, like I said, they're bought and paid for by the lobby. The lobby spends, like I said, $100 million to ensure that Congress is the best that they can buy. And so they can't move. They're like a battleship, like a Zionist battleship. They can't turn, they can't move, they can't really, travel anywhere. So I think we have to focus on the future of the party. We have to focus on winning the primaries that the AIPAC has forced losses for progressives. And by the way, it's interesting that the DNC and some of these candidates who won the elections to the Congress, Democrats, who took huge amounts of funds. For example, in my state, the congressman from Boeing, I call him, Adam Smith, very powerful member of the military appropriations committee. He came out in favor of a suspension of offensive weapons to Israel, and he received nearly $1 million from AIPAC over the last two cycles. So, yeah, you look like you wanted to ask a
No, I
question.
just wanted to add something because you mentioned J.B. Pritzker and you said out of like Newsom, Buttigieg, Gretchen Whitmer. Pritzker is the only one that has supported blocking arms sales because, as Pritzker says, that sends the right message to Israel. And what's interesting is, Pritzker is not, even an anti-Zionist. He's not even really fully aligned with the progressive left. And yet, in the past 2 years, we've seen conspiracy theories pushed by the right-wing Heritage Foundation and their Project Esther plan to supposedly eliminate anti-Semitism, saying Pritzker is part of the Hamas support network. It's utter madness. They're attacking people that aren't even particularly anti-Israel. I mean, Pritzker isn't like the ultimate voice for Palestinians, even. And even
No.
he's looking at it and saying, this is bad. And what's happening? They're attacking him. And
Yeah. That's right. I mean, people like Pritzker are dangerous as far as the lobby is concerned, and the lobby will be plowing hundreds of millions of dollars into the other three candidates, depending on who comes out in the horse race as
is it
being
true,
the
though? He's not, he seems very moderate in a lot of ways.
yeah. I mean, I think that he's like an Illinois liberal Democrat, basically. And I don't know what his politics are around Israel, but he's probably a liberal Zionist, which is kind of middle of the road for American Jewish uh, attitudes towards Israel. He's no radical by any means. He's not even, Bernie Sanders, although I think Sanders' views have influenced him. And Bernie Sanders, by the way, isn't the best that we have to offer because some of his views, he doesn't use the term genocide either, Bernie. And before Gaza, the genocide, his views they were left wing, but they weren't anti-Zionist. So Pritzker is that's why I said it may mean that Pritzker is going to take a more independent perspective on this. And I think that the fact that he's willing to say that what you just said indicates that he's, as a politician, as a smart, perceptive politician, he knows that that's the direction that American public opinion and opinion among Democrats is going. So he's seen the defeat of Kamala Harris, by the way, which happened at least in large part because she refused to do anything about genocide other than to express hopes and prayers that it would end. And Joe Biden himself, same thing. So that's a dead end for the party. And I think Pritzker is sort of trying to navigate what will be the future for the party. And I'm just hoping he continues and he doesn't collapse into this sort of traditional pro-Israel Democratic, pablum that we've been hearing for decades.
What do you think activists and people that care about this issue can do to make sure that doesn't happen? I mean, I've seen a lot of people that are bitter that figures like Pritzker haven't come around sooner or they're not radical enough. What would your advice be to those sort of activists or people that may have that may not trust that things are going to go in the right direction? How can they ensure things will? And how do you welcome people without giving naive trust to people?
Well, as someone who's been involved in this issue for, I hate to date myself, but 6 decades, I've been through a lot over that time, and it's been a very lonely existence to be left wing, and I was even a liberal Zionist until a few decades ago. So even that sort of like modest progressive point of view put me and all people like me into a minority, into a denounced minority. I mean, I've been in organizations that rabbis have excommunicated, according to religious law, and I've gotten death threats from JDL murderers and all sorts of things. So today, again, unfortunately, due to these horrible circumstances, I'm no longer in the minority. I'm no longer out in the wilderness as far as this sort of thing goes. So I think that I know it's very frustrating for younger people to say, why aren't things changing? I mean, it's clear what is going on. Why is it taking people so long to come around to this point of view? I just think that, you know, the Israel lobby has been around since 1951. That's when AIPAC started. And they didn't start plowing this level of funding into elections until much later. But you know, AIPAC has made American politics fall into lockstep with a pro-Israel perspective. So these things don't change overnight. I mean, I just had somebody on Twitter, not denounce me, but say, you know, look at all the success that you've had over that time period. You know, you waste, you know, it's a waste. You did nothing. And you know, that sort of nihilism and cynicism is exactly what pro-Israel apologists do themselves. Like they say, Israel is doing nothing and worse than Myanmar or whatever, and the whataboutism. And it's a dead end in terms of a political argument. And I'm very skeptical in some ways of people, sort of Johnny come lately, people who come over to the cause, uh, because you do say like, oh, you know, you supported Israel for decades, and now all of a sudden you're coming on board. So that's partly what I feel, but also I feel like the people who change their mind, for example, somebody like Peter Beinart, he was a liberal Zionist, you know, 2 decades ago,
Right.
and
Yeah, I've
now
I've
he's an
had Peter on the
anti-Zionist,
show. Yeah.
and he's an anti-Zionist now. Um, and so, you know, we can't look askance at people like that. Even though some in this sort of pro-Palestine movement do say, you know, Johnny come lately, you know, where were you when we needed you, et cetera. I understand that skepticism, and I understand the level of hurt and pain that people like that feel, because they, like me, have been in the wilderness and they've been doing this, and now all of a sudden what they do is more mainstream, and it's sort of like it hits them hard that all of a sudden, you know, they're not like getting denounced in the same way they were, except for, you know, instances like Pritzker, like you mentioned. um, so I think we have to try to take a less skeptical and less negative attitude, because we need to build a movement. And that's the way, by the way, you were asking me about how to you know, achieve success in this. And I think that we need to draw more people on. I mean, we need to take those Congress members who took all of that money from AIPAC and say, okay, your views now are better than they were. They're not yet there, but we'll take it for now. We'll take it because you have to get to a destination. You have to go through. You have to slog through a lot of stuff.
I mean, the
Um,
point blank, do you think there does need to be like a sort of coalition where you have people that are adamantly anti-Zionist saying, well, if Pritzker's saying we should block arms, then good for Pritzker saying that. Even if Pritzker
uh,
isn't all the way an anti-Zionist or anything, it's still something that, you know, I mean, we can agree on the arms issue.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, we have to be skeptical and we have to watch and see how his views change if they do. And we have to be prepared to criticize strongly if you know, he turns away from these views. But I don't think that we get to say, oh yeah, Pritzker, you know, liberal Zionist, you know, what good is he? He doesn't have the right approach, and if you don't have the right approach, then you're worse than people who like Trump. I think that's a luxury that we don't really have. And the perfect is the enemy of the good, you know, in this case. So politicians are never, ever going to be perfect. You know, even Bernie Sanders, who comes the closest to it, or AOC, who comes maybe even closer than that, they're not perfect, you know. And so we want perfection if we can get it, and we want to pull politicians and Jews and Americans in our direction as much as we can, but we don't have the luxury of denouncing them for not being fully left wing or anti-Zionist.
I know this is a little bit outside of the scope of your article, but I did want to address it because you mentioned it. You mentioned how a lot of major Jewish organizations that make up the sort of leadership of American Jewish communal life. I know Peter Beinart and Ron Campais has said you can call it the American Jewish establishment. That it's sort of become this wealthy gerontocracy that's fossilized. Do you have any thoughts on how it got to that point?
Well, the history of Zionism in America is interesting because if you go back in the world, in the diaspora, by the way, if you go back to 1910, 1920, you had a wealthy Jewish minister of the government, Montague is his name, denounce Zionism and say that Zionism is going to cause anti-Semitism because it's going to cause the dual loyalty aspect because people are going to be able to say Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to their country, and that's prophetic. You know, you had American Jewish rabbis, Reform rabbis, also being anti-Zionist, and it was a much more mainstream view until the Holocaust. So the Holocaust changed everything. The Holocaust destroyed the movement for a binational state in Israel, and it also transformed Zionism into the kind of majority point of view. And then in 51, you have AIPAC founded. And so gradually over time, American Jews developed this loyalty, this ironclad loyalty to Israel. And it morphed into the monster that AIPAC is, and not just AIPAC, but the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, et cetera. There are other groups too, and so they have this monolith now going. By the way, as I said in my article, they don't have a monopoly on the views of American Jews. The truth of the matter is that most American Jews can't stand the mainstream organizations, or they're just kind of uninterested in them. They're uninterested in this religion that they've turned Zionism into, and so they don't affiliate with any of those groups. And those groups aren't democratic, and they don't. They claim to represent American Jews, but they don't. Their membership and their donors are a tiny slice of American Jews. So what we have to do is figure out how we're going to attract the silent majority of American Jews to this perspective, and we're having a lot of success, thankfully, over the last couple of years.
I was going to say it's an interesting observation you made about Zionism and how it can feel anti-Semitism because as you said that, I was thinking about the Israeli ex-spy Jonathan Pollard, who is apparently running for Knesset. And this is a guy who goes around in the media and says, you should have dual loyalty for Israel if you are Jewish. And if you don't do everything for Israel, you should spy for Israel if you work in the U.S. government. Now, I think Pollard did what he did for money and then in the aftermath of that sort of made it into a thing where, oh, I was protecting Israel. But he's literally basically calling for a dual loyalty thing and he's feeding into that trope, which is dangerous. It endangers Jews.
I think that that's an important. This whole issue, this whole discussion about this issue is very important to Jews because, first of all, as I mentioned, Zionism has become a religion for American Jews. And for somebody like Sheldon Adelson, he was loyal to Zionism and he didn't give a crap about Judaism as a religion. And that's a very, very dangerous place to go because you have not just Arabs and pro-Palestinian people who are fooled by this into believing that all Jews are Zionists. You have this crazy statistic that people quote, like 95% of American Jews are Zionists, which is based on a totally false misinterpretation of a small study that was done by a pollster several years ago. And the majority of American Jews are not Zionist. And how do you define Zionism? I think the majority of American Jews don't really care one way or the other. And they certainly wouldn't identify. If they do identify themselves as Zionist, what they're saying is we have a certain level of identity with Israel. We kind of like Israel. Like is probably a good term. We like Israel. We like the idea that Israel is there. But that's not really Zionism, in my opinion. That's Zionism light, maybe. So we've abandoned our actual religion of Judaism, and we've turned Judaism into a sidekick of Israel and Zionism. And we've turned Zionism into a religion, and our religion has been hijacked by this political nationalism called Zionism. And so we can't quarrel with people that accept the terms that we ourselves have set, where Bibi Netanyahu says Zionism and I represent all of the Jewish people. That's what Zionism says. And so if that's true, which it isn't true, but if that premise is accepted, then it's going to be accepted by anti-Semites, it's going to be accepted by neo-Nazis, it's going to be accepted by the anti-imperialist left, like Glenn Greenwald and all that group. And it's going to be accepted by terrorists and by Islamists because they don't know better. They're just taking Israeli and Zionist statements on its own terms. And so that's what happens. You have anti-Semitism, you have attacks on Jews because of this. So it's a really dangerous place to go.
Just a few more things I wanted to cover here. At the end of your article, you talk about this humanitarian aid, I use that in quotes, Operation the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I've been covering that a lot lately. It's my God, is it just this horrific, like, just it's like a black hole of mercenaries and ex-CIA people and just tons of money being made off of this, and it's all done to basically imprison and dislocate Palestinians in Gaza. And then you also mentioned this Boston consulting group that devised a $5 billion plan calling for voluntary relocation. We should use that in quotes of the entire population. And then there's also I know that you've written about this, but this thing called the Great Trust, the Gaza Reconstruction, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation Trust. That, I mean, they show a picture of what Gaza will like in the aftermath, and it just makes me think of what I think it was Trump or Jared Kushner, maybe both, that said, "Well, it's a prime piece of real estate." I mean, this is all being done for like money, and there's no concern for the loss of human life. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was actually a creature of Israeli sort of strategists, Israeli business people who wanted to create a plan to end the presence of Palestinians in Gaza, and also a plan for quote unquote the day after. What would happen in Gaza after Hamas is destroyed, and we're now prepared for the future of Gaza without Palestinians, by the way. So they created this plan. That was the first thing that happened here. And they managed to enlist people in the Trump administration. They managed to get some funding from, by the way, an American tech entrepreneur. Those of you who are of my age in school remember Rand McNally maps and atlases. So he's a scion of that family, and he has a venture capital firm, and they created the parent company for the group that's doing the security and distributing the food in Gaza.
By the way, that's
So
what I meant by there's like shady ties with all those security firms that are working with this. I mean, the rabbit hole on it is insane, but go on.
yeah, yeah. And so, the foundation recruited American mercenaries essentially. And by the way, they're in cahoots with the Israeli military. So both
And they're
the
doing a
American
real life
mercenaries,
version of the. I'm sorry to interrupt again, but they're doing a real life version of Squid Games, essentially.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
ridiculous. They're shooting these
Hunger,
people. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and the passageways these starving Palestinians have to go through in order to get to the distribution points, puts them in the line of fire of the IDF, which kills them with impunity. 2,000 Palestinians killed coming to these distribution centers and at them. And the mercenaries are taking pot shots at them, and the IDF is, and that's how they have all been killed. And none of these people pose a threat to anything or anyone. They don't have weapons. Hamas is not involved. Why are they doing this? It's just an extension of a plan to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza from Palestinians, so that they can activate this plan that you mentioned, which uses all of these acronyms that Trump loves. That's why GREAT is such a great acronym for them. They're doing it to curry favor with Trump, who's called Gaza, the future of Gaza, the Riviera of the Mediterranean. Um, so that's what this all is aiming for. You terrorize Palestinians not just by destroying 90% of the infrastructure and buildings in Gaza, but by terrorizing them into leaving voluntarily, as you said.
do you think
Um,
that things like one of the things that I knew a lot of people, including people around me, were angry about because I grew up in a Catholic family, so when the news came out of the Holy Family Church getting attacked, I was just thinking to myself, what is this? I mean, it seems like almost psychological terrorism.
yeah, yeah. I
I mean,
mean, and
going
to
after
his
a church. I mean,
Yeah, and to his credit, Pope Francis expressed as much opposition to this as possible by calling the lay leader of the church every night, every single night. He checked in with him, and that was what the Pope felt that he could do. And I think that American Christians are even more appalled, except for the evangelicals who are locked into Israel.
but it
But
seems like these actions are about trying to, it's not just about causing physical damage. It's almost like just trying to break the spirit of Palestinians and their
yeah,
what's called in Palestinian society samud, you know?
steadfastness.
Yes.
I don't think that Israel is going to be able to break the will of the Palestinians. You had 600 former IDF generals and intelligence chiefs sit around a table. I watched this video and I was shocked. They were saying, "We can't win this war. We can't destroy Hamas. We can't destroy the will of the Palestinian people. No amount of military force is going to be able to change that equation." And so Netanyahu is leading us down a dead end, and we've got to stop it somehow. Now, you can say these guys conveniently, they when they were in power, they were among the most bloodthirsty that you can be. When they get out of power and they don't have any impact, then they can afford to have a conscience. So that's a feeling that I've had very often in situations like this. But I think that it's an indication of a sea change among people who are military thinkers and strategists. That the only way to get to a good place here, free the hostages, end the war, is to recognize that we've been defeated. And this is a blog post that I wrote a couple of days ago that an IDF general wrote a report denouncing the way in which Israel has conducted the war and called the war. He said, "We have failed," and on from that. Now he's a military person, so he has all these things he throws in there, like we've lost all of our credibility internationally because of the incompetence of the aid program, which has, in his terms, falsely accused us of hunger. But he's basically saying it's our own fault, even if you accept his terms, which we don't, he's still saying that it's a miserable failure. The whole thing is just total failure. So I think that that's something is that many people in Israel are aware of. You have the hostage families protesting angrily outside the homes of the ministers of the government, saying, we want our children back. We want the 20 that are alive. We want them alive and we want them back. And we don't want Netanyahu, and we're protesting against him, and we want the war to end. So unfortunately, Netanyahu has a stable coalition, and no one is willing to jump ship and topple the government. And we have until 2026 before he has to go to election. So we have, unfortunately, a while to wait.
If you could, so you mentioned that IDF general wrote this report, and that was in relation to, I think they're calling it Operation Gideon's Chariots. What is that?
Well, he denounced Gideon's charity. I'm sorry, Gideon's chariot, which was one of the many named operations that Netanyahu has come up with over the last 2 years. But I think that the terms he used to criticize that operation apply to the whole war itself, and that's why those 600 security personnel resonate so much, because they weren't just criticizing one operation. They were criticizing the entire war and all the premises on which it was based. But Gideon's Chariot was a plan and they're implementing it actually right now. It's a plan to, the defense minister has come up with this plan to turn part of Gaza into a quote unquote humanitarian city, which basically would imprison the Palestinians who could not leave it once they were in there. So he wants to put 600,000 Palestinians in there, and that's leading up to expelling them, which so far isn't explicitly part of the plan, but everybody knows that's what they want. So that plan is for the IDF to enter Gaza City, to conquer Gaza City, to eradicate. By the way, there are now 800,000 Palestinians crowding into Gaza City who have not left. As many have left, but not those 800,000, because there's nowhere else to go. So that's a plan to do that. And by the way, 48 IDF soldiers have been killed since Operation Gideon's Chariot started. So people in Israel are tired of their children dying. And also, even military reservists who are not on active duty, many of them have been through 6 tours of duty in Gaza. And everybody is just disgusted, even those serving in the military. By the way, there was just an op-ed by a reservist who said, I served in Gaza, not going anymore. I've had it. So, I mean, yes, people can say, and I would say, yeah, but you served 2 tours of duty in Gaza. What all of a sudden gave you the revelation that what you were doing was a bad thing? And we can add that his considerations probably were not only moral, because you lose your profession, you lose your income, you lose your career when you're going into the reserves 6 times. You're impoverishing your family. So there's a lot of economic reasons and practical reasons why many of these reservists are refusing to serve. But the main thing is they're refusing to serve. So let's welcome that, even as we're critical of the basis of their decisions and their criticism.
Going back to all these consulting groups and this whole great trust, can you talk about the U.S. trusteeship situation with Gaza and the plans for that? I mean, it's really grotesque. This idea of, oh, we're gonna turn it into a gleaming tourism resort and high-tech manufacturing and technology hub. Yeah, and you're gonna flatten Gaza to do it. It's grotesque to me.
Yeah, I mean, every premise of this, and I wrote about this, I think in the article in Jacobin and in my blog, every premise of this plan is bogus. Every premise is completely delusional.
Well, I think you
So,
said that first off, the trusteeships must be recognized by the UN.
Actually, after I wrote that, I read what Israel's definition of a trusteeship is, which, by the way, flies in the face of every previous trusteeship internationally. And the last one was a Palau in 1994. And that was a UN-sponsored trusteeship. And the UN gave the trusteeship, I think, to the United States, which relinquished the trusteeship and it became independent. So what Israel is now going to claim is that because it owns Gaza, it has the right to declare itself, to declare Gaza a trusteeship that it administers without any UN approval, without anyone in the world approving it. And they're saying that there's some kind of obscure part of international law because they control Gaza. Now they're able to dispose of Gaza. And the plan is for Israel, once it becomes a trustee, I don't know if that's the right term, once it becomes a trustee, it will hand off Gaza to a consortium of unspecified countries, mostly Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., and they will then administer the trusteeship. What they will do, nobody knows. How they will do it, nobody knows. And then also, of course, they'll get rid of all the Palestinians. Where will they go? Nobody knows. They're boasting about how they're talking to South Sudan, which is in the middle of its own genocide. They'll maybe send them to Libya, which is in the midst of its own civil war. They'll send them to who God knows where. They're talking about Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. And Indonesia has said, yeah, we'll take a few hundred or a few thousand Palestinians who need medical treatment. But they haven't said, oh, by the way, we're willing to take 100,000 Palestinians, no problem. What country wants to you hear about countries that the xenophobia and hatred of refugees is so intense, including, by the way, in Trump's America. What country is willing to destabilize itself with internal political opposition and with taking a huge number of foreign refugees into their own society? It's preposterous. So you have Israel Katz's plan for a humanitarian city, which is basically a concentration camp, and I just realized this. So the part of this great plan is that, yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but for every dollar that we spend to create this beautiful place, we're going to earn $4 back. So if we spend $1 billion on this, which is going to cost more, by the way, then we're going to earn $4 billion. And how are we going to do this? Because we're going to generate all sorts of revenue streams by rebuilding Gaza, by the developments, by the resorts, by all of that stuff that's going to happen supposedly in Gaza. So this is a grift. This isn't like, for the benefit of anyone in particular except Israel.
And it's certainly not going to be for Palestinians.
No, this is going to be for the benefit of the investors. This is a perfect grift for someone like Trump. This is what he's done for decades to become the billionaire that he is. So this is the sort of underpinnings of this plan. By the way, Washington Post broke this story. Its veteran foreign policy expert, Karen DeYoung, wrote the story, and she just reported all of the terms of this plan, which, if you know what you're reading and what you're talking about regarding Israel and the Middle East, you can read into it how preposterous it is. But there is not an ounce of skepticism that she levels against this plan. She barely mentions the fact that some of this might be kind of off the wall, or she doesn't use that term, of course. So it's typical liberal Zionist media stuff, although at least it was reported, and at least you and I have the ammunition to criticize it because it's out there and published. But the American media is lacking any critical focus on what's going on, and that's part of the problem. That's part of the reason why 80% of Americans aren't opposed to the genocide in Gaza. Instead, it's like 50% or so. Um, and so they're not doing their job, but that's a whole different discussion.
I wanted to ask you this in closing, and I don't know if you've seen it or even have an opinion on it, but I was curious, do you have any thoughts on that recent Richie Torres interview that's been making the rounds? I believe it was this comedian Adam Friedland did the interview. Have you thought about that at all? Because it was really hard to watch in a lot of ways because you just have Richie Torres writing off this young Jewish man who is anguished about what's happening in Gaza. And Richie Torres is, well, you just don't know what you're talking about. And he's just telling this like Jewish kid, like, no, your opinion doesn't matter. Your thoughts don't matter.
Yeah, Richie Torres is really a piece of work. And by the way, he's a member of Congress, but he's gotten probably more money, more funding from APAC, maybe other than someone like Adam Smith, who is like the he has a major impact on arms shipments to Israel. Adam Smith does. Richie Torres is just a toady. He doesn't have really any impact on Israel or on what's going on in Congress regarding Israel. He's a toady. He's a mouthpiece. That's why he's useful to Palestinians, and he's gay, and he's a person of color. So that's a trifecta as far as Israel and APAC
You said
is
he's
concerned.
useful. You meant he's useful to Israelis?
He's useful to the Israel lobby,
Okay.
and he's useful to Israelis by extension. But he's a Zionist toady. And I didn't see that. And now that you mentioned that, I'm going to go back and look at that. But I followed Richie Torres for years. And by the way, he's blocked me, and he's blocked almost everyone who's ever criticized him on the social media, which is more funny than it is anything else. But I've heard him say, for example, when he's talking with people who claim that it's a genocide, he doesn't like give any evidence to support his point of view that it isn't. He just says it's not a genocide. It's just not a genocide. It's an incorrect term or whatever he says. But that's the extent of the argument that these people mount. It's just not a genocide. And some of the pro-Israel apologists were saying it's not a genocide because the number of Palestinians in Israel is more than it was in 1948. Which, first of all, that's not the definition of genocide. The definition is much wider than just how many people you get to kill. And also it ignores demographics, which is the natural increase of population over decades. And if you like expelled 1 million Palestinians and left only 250,000 in 1948, yeah, of course you're going to get 1 or 2 million by 2025. So that's the level of argument that these people present. It's just pathetic. And Richie Torres is pathetic. And I hope he has a primary challenge that happens to him. But he's going to get hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund his campaigns from Zionist donors.
When you get a chance, you'll have to check out that interview I mentioned because the host even says to him, he says to Richie Torres, "Shut up" at one point, and that to me is like a glorious moment because someone needed to say that to Richie Torres. But
Yeah, somebody needs to say it to him on social media or just somehow like tape his mouth shut or
well,
something.
seeing
I don't
someone
know.
say it to him in the middle of an interview is chef's kiss. But
Yeah.
in closing, what do you want my listeners to get out of the conversation we've been having here for the past hour? I know a lot of people are despairing right now, but I feel like you caught on something earlier. The Palestinian steadfastness isn't going away. So is there a silver lining? Is there hope still?
Well, I'm not hopeful. I mean, of course, I'm hopeful in some sense, but I'm not hopeful in the short term. I think, when I was younger, and I'm 73 now, when I was younger, I was liberal Zionist and I was hopeful. And I said, of course, this conflict is going to be resolved in my lifetime. Of course it is. And I was working towards, let's see if we can get a good Israeli government that's willing to negotiate a settlement of this and all sorts of other things like that. But now, I'm in my later years, although I don't want to admit it, and I know that it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Israel is too entrenched, too powerful militarily and economically. It's got a lot of time and energy that it can hold out against this, unless, of course, like we talked about, you get an American government that's willing to say no, which will happen. I'm persuaded that that will happen. But I think what we have to do is we have to continue what we're doing. We have to be steadfast. We have to go to the rallies. We have to join Jewish Force for Peace. If you're Jewish, even if you're not Jewish, you can join. Have to join, if not now, another one of these groups. And we have to support publications like Jewish Currents if you're Jewish and you're interested in what they put out. And we have to support members of Congress who are willing to be independent and defy AIPAC. Those of us who have some funds should make donations. That doesn't take a lot, by the way. Bernie Sanders raised, like, I don't know how much, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, based on people giving $5 and $10. So it all adds up. We have to try to hold out glimmers of hope for this situation and not give up. We have to support Palestinians. We have to support people. By the way, the Israeli and the Palestinian came up with No Other Land, the film that won an Oscar, even though people have raised questions about the Israeli participation in that project. I think we have to try not to be too cynical about things like that. Yuval Avraham, who was the co-producer of that film, is a righteous man. He writes for 972 magazine, which is one of the premier Israeli dissident publications. So the fact that he may have served in the IDF at one point, or the fact that all sorts of things are being criticized about that film. But we have to remember, it helped the sea change that's happening, both in Israel and, even more importantly, outside of Israel. Winning an Oscar for a film that deals with Palestine is huge. It's huge, regardless of the context that you want to be critical. So don't give up on something because it's not pure and it's not perfect. And we're working towards the perfect and the pure. That's our job. But we don't give up, and we don't sort of become cynical and denounce people because they're not good enough and they're not pure enough.
Well, I want to thank you again, Richard Silverstein, for coming on Parallax Views. People can keep up with your work at richardsilverstein.com, and they can also find you on social media. Anything I missed? And thanks again.
I write periodically for Jacobin, and I write for two other publications, The New Arab and Middle East Eye. So anyone who's familiar with them, take a look. My articles are there in their archive.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to
Galen, Matt,
Gunnar, Mark,
Simon,
Alexander, Catherine,
G,
Tilo, Emilia,
Jeremy,
Jeff,
WV,
John,
Bert,
Brian, Elliot,
Darko,
Tilo, Luke, Michael, Brace,
James,
Nick,
Mark M, Mersham,
Galen,
Gareth,
Arlen,
Tilo, Luke,
Bo,
Christopher, Michael,
Gigadelic Media,
Will,
Chance, Chase,
JC,
Dan,
Big Bob, David H, Y, Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen,
David,
Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch,
Gary,
Max,
Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho,
Brian,
Nobody, Thomas, and Dano.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time,
You've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.